um, there's a picture, a portrait of a toddler, and that toddler is dressed in stereotypical little boy clothes or little girl clothes. Let's say little girl clothes first. And uh, there were 5 or 6 adults, and they were interviewed one by one. They came into the room, they looked at the portrait, and the interviewer asked a series of 4 questions. He said, "What do you think that child's name might be? What do you think their behavior, their character might be like? What do you think their hobbies, what might their hobbies be? And what do you think their future might be career wise?" So they went through that with the 5 or 6 adults. And then they brought in a new portrait. And this portrait was of a child and dressed in stereotypical little girl clothes. The adults came in one by one, asked the same questions as before, and then left. And then the group came back into the room, and there were the 2 portraits there. And the interviewer said, "Okay, now look at your the answers to your questions. Like, think about what you said for those 4 questions for each one of these photos, and then think it's the same child." So it's kind of
Yes.
like the responses were based on what you thought, and I mean, it's quite fascinating, and it's consistent every single time I have done that activity. It is consistent that there will be some part of unconscious gender bias that comes into it because you have associated a gender with that child. And that's where it all starts. So until you're aware of that you're doing that, so you have to be really quite curious about how you think, how your perspective is impacting how you're parenting.
And it's I mean, one thing I talk to friends about, I've talked about on the podcast like a lot, is just how our kids are just mirrors of what we are. Like, you know, it's something that um, I've spoken about, where it's like I've worked out over the years that sometimes the things that I get most frustrated with my children about are the exact things that I'm doing, and
Mm-hmm.
it takes that step back where it's like, you know, you see them doing something and you kind of feel the frustration coming up, and it's like, hang on, why am I frustrated here? And it's like, oh shit, like that's me, like that's why I'm getting frustrated, and that's a
Yeah.
part of me that I'm not happy with. And I guess that's kind of the same thing that you're saying there. Like, the parents have these inherent biases that they've got based off whatever context they're looking at, and that's going to be picked up by the kids eventually.
So you have that like inner baggage yourself that until you start to look into it, it stays there and it impacts. Like a really easy thing is if you're having some situation with your child, uh, and if you are reacting in a certain way, and if you can think in your head, would I react the same way? Would I say the same thing if it wasn't my son but it was my daughter? And sometimes that, because sometimes you really will say no. If my little girl did that, I would not react the same way that I am with my little boy doing it. So that's one thing. But the other thing is the awareness of how society also is doing that in so many ways. And even if it's not so deep in your family parenting, your child is getting bombarded with messages from society about what it means. I mostly talk about boys. So, what it means to be a boy. And so, they, like, when I started understanding about this, it was called the Boy Code. And that first was coined by Dr. William Pollock, who did gender studies out of Harvard. And when he talked, now I've heard it talked more recently as the man box. And there's a guy from Australia actually that talks quite well and with humor about that. But it's these myths. It's like, okay, boys are supposed to be boys. So the boy is supposed to be the strong, the leader, all the things that go with what you think a boy should be. And then boys will be boys. So that's when you start saying, Well, yeah, it's okay for him to, to punch that kid because that's what boys do when they're, when they're mad. And so behavior gets explained away because that's boys. And will be boys, should be boys, and then boys are toxic. So the basic idea is that there is something um, ingrained, like it's in them. There's something inherently wrong with boys. There is
Mm,
something to be fearful of. And that message comes across to our kids through things that they see in the movies, things they read, the songs they hear. It's every place. So what you get is a little boy who starts out just pure, naive, kind, sweet, just beautiful. And as time goes on, he experiences situations where how he is authentically feeling is not acceptable. So, for example, 4-year-old little boy is learning to ride his bicycle with his mom or his dad. And he falls down and he hurts himself and he cries. And the parent says, oh, come on, it's not that bad. You're fine. Get on, get going, try it again, be a big boy. So what that little boy learns is that the person that he loves the most and wants to be connected with, that parent, they're telling him that that's not the behavior that is acceptable. So if he wants to stay in the good books with his parent, he can't show that behavior.